We need help over here. She's hurt bad. I need assistance now.
He knelt there in the rain on that lonely farm road. A quiet veteran dad holding a young deputy who could barely stay conscious, calling out for help with everything in him. Knowing this moment in the dark might decide if she lives or dies. Most folks in town only ever saw him fixing fences and tractors. Nobody knew he once fought battles far from here. Battles that trained him for this exact second. Like the video, share it with someone who believes true heroes don't need a spotlight. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to where it all began. Colton Hawley lived like the kind of man who belonged to the soil, not to headlines, not to applause, not to anyone's attention. His days were filled with grease on his hands, the slow hum of diesel engines warming up at sunrise, and the stubborn bolts on tractor frames that had been rusted in place since before he was born. Folks around the small county never thought much about it, because men like him faded into the background like fence posts along an old gravel road, dependable, unnoticed, necessary. In public he spoke softly, never gloating, never inserting himself into the loud opinions that sometimes filled the diner booths after church on Sunday. He'd fix an old hay baler for the Johnson Ranch before noon, then swing by the feed store to grab a bag of pellets for his chickens, nodding politely to the older farmers sipping coffee by the front window. They'd wave, he'd nod, and the rhythm would continue without question. Most people in that rural Midwest community saw him as a handyman, someone who could make anything mechanical work again with nothing more than a wrench. A steady mind, and a quiet patience that never seemed to crack under daily frustrations. He felt safest in those routines, away from chaos, away from the intensity of his past. His daughter Sadie, just 7 years old, loved to ride along in the truck as he went from farm to farm. She'd sit in the back seat with her feet swinging, humming songs she learned in Sunday school, her innocence radiating like a candle in a draftless room. He loved hearing her little voice echo through the cab, especially when she laughed. She had his eyes, deep, observant, but hers didn't hold the shadows his sometimes carried when he stared too long at the horizon. When neighbors looked at him, they saw a father doing his best. They saw a man who worked with his hands and came home tired but satisfied. They never wondered what he used to be, because small towns often assume the present defines a man completely. They had no idea that here and there, in the quiet moments of the night when he tucked Sadie into bed, Colton would sometimes pause longer than usual, as if remembering men he once carried off the battlefield, or the sound of a radio call he'd sworn he'd never hear again. Every now and then, late at night, he'd sit on the tailgate under the stars with a thermos of black coffee, listening to distant coyotes and the slow creak of the barn roof cooling after a hot day. In those moments he reminded himself that he wasn't that medic anymore. That chapter was closed, locked away, almost forgotten. He told himself he was just a dad in a quiet Midwest county, nothing more. That illusion was comforting. That illusion kept everything stable. The county knew nothing of the patches he once wore. They never saw the certificates in the old footlocker kept hidden in the attic, nor the photographs tucked away in a box with dog-eared edges and faces that time had taken from him. Colton preferred silence over explanation. He preferred simple dignity over telling war stories to strangers who had never smelled burnt sand or blood drying in 40-degree heat inside a foreign tent. He sometimes wondered if the Lord gave him this small life because he knew Colton needed a gentler season, a valley instead of a battlefield, a place to raise Sadie and rebuild what trauma had hollowed out inside him. And for years, that simplicity held. It felt steady, predictable, healthy. Those who casually waved to him at the feed store assumed they already understood who he was. The same way men assume they already know the shape of the land they've been driving past for years. They never considered that beneath the gentle routine, there could be hidden depth forged under circumstances they couldn't fathom. The kind of depth that never gets mentioned, because mentioning it would open old wounds that need to remain sealed. Colton woke every morning believing that peace could survive as long as he didn't look backward. He believed that if he focused on Sadie, on work, on faith, on keeping his head down, the past would stay buried. And for a long time that worked. He blended into the quiet heartbeat of rural life, the way some veterans do, almost invisible, almost anonymous, just another father doing his best in a country filled with ordinary men quietly carrying their own ghosts. To everyone around him, he was just Colton Hawley, the guy who fixed tractors and showed up at school recitals with a quiet smile, the man who never bragged, never broke, never tried to prove anything to anyone. That ordinary rhythm held firm, until one storm-soaked evening reminded him, violently, that sometimes the past does not stay buried forever. The rain had already started drifting sideways across the blacktop by the time Colton loaded the takeout bags onto the passenger seat, the scent of barbecue filling the truck cab with that familiar warm comfort every rural family recognizes on tired weekday nights. Sadie, buckled in the back seat, leaned her forehead against the cool window, tracing raindrops with her finger as they rolled down and merged like tiny rivers. The windshield wipers howled a steady rhythm, swish, swish, over the glass, clearing temporary pockets of clarity in a storm that had swallowed the horizon. It was the kind of rural darkness that city people never truly experience, a darkness so complete it made the world outside the headlights feel like an empty void. The only shapes visible were the silhouettes of barns hiding behind curtains of falling rain, and the ghost-like reflection of fence posts flickering in the side mirrors. The radio crackled a soft hum of static, not music, just the empty white noise that filled those no-signal backroads, between farm fields. Sadie hummed a gentle tune, half awake, her voice like a small thread of hope cutting through the storm. Colton steadied the wheel with the kind of ease that only comes from years of driving through unpredictable weather. The truck felt like an extension of his own hands, steady, calm, grounded. There was nothing unusual about this return trip, nothing alarming. Just a father bringing home dinner, trying to make sure his daughter stayed warm and safe on a night when the world outside seemed cold and indifferent. Storms never bothered him. In fact, he sometimes found their chaos strangely peaceful, because storms were honest. They didn't pretend to be something they weren't. The road was familiar, a two-lane country strip of asphalt that cut through fields of wheat and dry weeds that rattled violently in the wind. There were no porch lights out here, no neighbors watching from windows, no passing traffic most nights after sunset. If a man broke down here, he'd have to solve it himself or wait a long time before someone drove by. But Colton wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about whether Sadie would eat her mashed potatoes before touching the chicken, because she always saved her favorite part for last. The storm thickened, wind pushing sheets of rain so hard that the wipers struggled to keep up. Headlights stretched through the darkness like two narrow lifelines dragging the truck through a void of black and silver. Colton reached over and lowered the radio volume further, letting the gentle hum of the engine become the soundtrack to their slow journey home. He didn't notice anything strange. There was no sense of threat, no instinctive warning, just the kind of scene that thousands of rural families experience every year, a quiet drive on a wet night. Then, suddenly, something foreign interrupted the steady pattern of roadway ahead. The faint outline of flashing lights appeared in the distance, barely visible at first, distorted by the rain. Not the bold, loud strobes of a full police intervention, but weak flickering like a dying signal in the dark. Sadie sat up straighter in her seat, her voice soft and curious, asking if another car was pulled over. Her innocence was still intact. She didn't know what signs look like when danger is nearby. She didn't know how death sometimes hides in the smallest shift of scenery. Colton's eyes narrowed. Instinct buzzed, subtle, not panic, but alertness. Something was wrong up there. The rain seemed to fall harder as he eased his foot off the accelerator and let the truck slow to a crawl, headlights cutting through the curtain of water like a knife slicing through fog. He didn't know yet what he would find. He didn't know that in mere minutes, the past he worked so hard to bury would drag him back into a world he tried so desperately to leave behind. But on that dark rural road, with Sadie watching and the storm pressing down, Fate was already shifting. The calm wasn't just fading, it was ending. And the storm outside was about to become nothing compared to the storm inside him once he saw what lay ahead in the headlights. The patrol vehicle looked wrong the moment the headlights fully hit it, positioned crooked across the asphalt as if it had spun sideways and never corrected. Emergency lights flickered weakly, like the last breaths of a dying lantern, distorted by rain pounding hard enough to make every reflection blur. The driver's side door hung open. The wind whipped it slightly back and forth. Sadie whispered his name, her voice small and confused, as if her young mind sensed something was deeply off, long before she understood what off really means in moments like this. Colton felt his heart tighten. This wasn't a normal traffic stop. This was the kind of stillness that follows violence, not warning someone about a broken taillight. He eased the truck onto the shoulder, hazard lights clicking in slow rhythm behind them. Rain hammered the windshield like gravel. The world outside felt like a battlefield again, not visually, but emotionally. That strange quiet before you know the full scope of what happened, before the truth comes into focus. He told Sadie to stay inside the truck for now while he stepped out, his boots sinking slightly into the wet gravel at the road's edge. The storm muffled sound, like God had thrown a heavy blanket over the world, muting everything except his own breathing. The beam from his headlights caught something on the asphalt, movement, faint, unsteady. He moved closer and saw a figure lying partially on her side, a woman in a sheriff's deputy uniform. Her hair soaked and stuck to her face, her breaths jagged and inconsistent. She tried to reach for something, maybe the radio, maybe the air, maybe hope, but her arm trembled and fell back against the pavement. It hit him hard, the exact type of physical collapse he had seen overseas more times than he ever wanted to remember. Her badge glinted through the rain. Morgan, Claire Morgan, early 20s. Barely older than some of the new recruits he once trained in foreign deserts. A fresh deputy, not seasoned, not hardened. A young professional who still had that look in her eyes of someone who believed the world made sense and justice always prevailed. Now she was bleeding out on a dark rural road where no one else would find her in time, unless someone like him acted right now. Her pulse was fading, weak, erratic, her airway compromised. He didn't need training manuals or equipment to recognize how close she was to death. Sadie called out from the truck, her tiny voice trembling, asking if the woman was okay. The question pierced him deeper than the storm. Innocence asking for reassurance while death hovered inches away. Claire tried to speak, but only a broken rasp escaped her throat. Blood pooled near her side, dark and diluted by sheets of rain. Colton's mind split. Part of him remained here, in the storm, as a father protecting his daughter from trauma, but another part slipped into a mental zone he hadn't entered in years. A zone shaped by triage tents, red sand, gauze, adrenaline, and screams swallowed by desert wind. What mattered most now was not how it happened, not who shot her, not when backup might arrive. There was no time for questions. This was the moment where life either continued or ended based on seconds. He didn't need to see the full wound to know she had only minutes. And out here, with no cell signal, no other headlights for miles, and the storm drowning out the world, he understood the truth. If he didn't intervene, she would die on this pavement, and Sadie would remember forever the night her father watched someone bleed out and did nothing. That thought alone lit something inside him that he had tried to hide from for years. He knelt in the rain beside her, his body blocking some of the wind from hitting her face. Her eyes met his wide, terrified, and yet he saw something else behind the fear. A desperate plea, not spoken, but clear. A plea to not be left alone in these final moments. He wasn't dealing with theory. He was dealing with a human soul hanging by a thread. Rainwater mixed with blood and ran toward the gutter, forming thin rivers that disappeared into darkness. No civilized man, no father, no neighbor, no Christian, could walk away from this moment. That was not who Colton Hiley was raised to be. That was not who he became overseas. And despite the years of silence since returning home, the battlefield was suddenly here again. Only now it was on a farm road in rural America instead of a foreign conflict zone. And the woman lying before him, barely holding on, was the catalyst that would reawaken everything he fought so hard to suppress. Something inside him shifted, not fully yet, but enough to know that the next choice would define everything that came afterward. Colton told Sadie to stay in the truck and lock the doors, his voice calm but firm, the tone of a man who wasn't asking for obedience, but commanding it with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how serious things were. Her small face pressed against the window, eyes wide with fear, hands trembling slightly as she nodded. She trusted him fully, because he never spoke in that tone unless something profound was occurring. Rain hammered the hood so loud it sounded like hail. For a split second, he saw his reflection in the glass, not the quiet farm repairman, but the medic, the man he used to be. He knelt in the storm beside Claire and placed his hand on her shoulder, steadying her as her breath fluttered in and out like a candle flickering in a cold draft. His old instincts didn't return gradually. They snapped into place like a switch flipping inside his soul. This wasn't memory in the slow, nostalgic sense. This was muscle memory, pure, distilled, automatic. His mind didn't analyze, it executed. Hands that fixed tractors hours earlier now moved with a precision he had once used to keep wounded soldiers alive while the world fell apart around them. He checked her airway first, adjusting her head angle to keep her from choking on her own blood, his fingers moving with an intense and eerie steadiness. Rain soaked both of them instantly, but Colton barely registered it. The storm became background noise, meaningless, irrelevant compared to the urgency at hand. His jaw tightened the way it always did when adrenaline surged, not as panic, but as clinical focus. His breath slowed, heart rate locked in. The world narrowed to one mission: keep this deputy breathing. As he assessed her injuries, his hands trembled, not because he was unsure, but because of the ghosts those movements summoned. Every stretch of skin, every drop of blood, every trembling inhale she fought for, triggered flashes of the past he spent years burying. Images slammed into his mind of dusty uniforms, sand-caked boots, makeshift field hospitals, the metallic scent of war that lingered even after scrubbing his hands raw. He forced those memories back into the shadows, because now wasn't about memory. Now was about duty. He tore fabric from his own shirt without hesitation, improvising a compression tool exactly like he had done in hostile environments where supply crates never arrived on time. He applied pressure, fingers locking down with the strength of a man who knew that even a half-second lapse could cost a life. Claire's eyes rolled slightly, but he spoke firmly to her, not loud, but intentional, giving her something to hold on to. He didn't speak about hope or fear. He spoke like a soldier stabilizing another in the field. This is what we do. We keep breathing. Stay with me, right here. The storm seemed to intensify, or maybe his awareness sharpened. Lightning cracked in the distance, illuminating the silhouettes of the farm fields around them. He remembered another lightning flash in another place far away. Different soil, different sky, same stakes. His shoulders tensed as trauma and purpose collided inside him. He knew this would change things. He knew this moment meant his quiet life might never return to the way it was. But he didn't pull back. He leaned in. Sadie watched through the fogged glass, tears streaming down her face, too young to fully grasp what was unfolding, but old enough to know that her father was stepping into something heavy, something she had never seen in him before. And she could feel that this was bigger than a simple roadside injury. There was meaning in the way he moved, as if the storm had peeled back the mask he wore every day, revealing the truth he never spoke aloud. Claire's breathing steadied slightly under his guidance. It wasn't enough, but it was something. And in moments like this, something could become everything. This was the turning point. This was where the quiet handyman became the soldier medic again. Not by words, not by choice, but by necessity. The man he used to be had just walked back into the world. Colton dug deeper into the instincts that had once guided him through nightmare battlefields overseas. And while the storm continued to thrash around him, He treated the environment as though it were a poorly supplied forward operating location rather than a rural roadside. He used the flat interior of his truck door as a surface to tear strips of his shirt with maximum tension, twisting the fabric into makeshift bindings, improvising like he had when supply lines were late or destroyed in transit. Rainwater poured off his face and dripped from his chin, but he paid no attention. The storm was just a backdrop. The real crisis was in his hands. He pressed his palm against the wound, establishing control of the bleeding, adjusting pressure with dynamic precision so he didn't crush tissue yet still maintained life. He inspected the wound with a practiced eye, not in a detached way, but in the way a field medic observes injury patterns to identify severity before it's too late. Claire's breaths were shallow, so he adjusted her posture to prevent airway obstruction. He remembered doing this same exact maneuver in a desert where the air was dry and scorching. Tonight, the rainwater replaced the sand, but the principle was identical. Keep the patient breathing no matter what. Improvising, he reached into the emergency kit he kept behind his seat, not because he ever expected to use it like this, but because some part of him always feared silence was temporary and storms always returned. He pulled out a roll of industrial tape he usually used to secure hoses or patch cracked coolant lines on tractors. He pressed the tape firmly against a layer of plastic torn from a sandwich bag in the glove compartment, converting it into a makeshift occlusive seal. It wasn't perfect, but it was as close to a battlefield chest seal as one could make in a Midwest rainstorm. He positioned it over her wound and taped the edges down with precision, sealing out water while using the improvised barrier to maintain negative pressure. Claire gasped as her lungs fought for air, but her body responded, slightly, the way a body responds when death is pushed back by a skilled hand. She blinked twice, a small flicker of consciousness. It was enough to tell him he was buying time. Colton spoke to her softly, not like a medic showing off technique, not like a rescuer trying to inspire hope, but like a soldier speaking to another human soul who needed to hear something steady and real. "Stay with me," he whispered. "We're not done. You're not done." He wasn't trying to convince her. He was commanding her. His voice contained that old tone, the tone that once stabilized wounded troops who fought to stay conscious until extraction arrived. Claire's eyes focused on him for a second, and that brief clarity told him she understood that the man kneeling beside her was not just a passerby. He was someone who had been here before, in a different uniform, with different stakes, but the same urgency. Sadie watched from inside the truck, tears streaming down her cheeks, breathing fogging up the glass as she pressed her face against the window. She saw her father's shoulders locked in tension, his movements quick yet controlled, and the rain didn't scare her as much as the silence between every breath that woman took. Even at 7 years old, she sensed that death was nearby, that this wasn't like when a calf got stuck in a fence or when a tractor needed repair. This was life or death. She could feel the weight of the storm and the weight of what her father was doing, and she felt helpless to do anything except watch him fight to hold on to life with his bare hands. Colton's mind processed next steps like a field medic triaging under fire. His eyes scanned the patrol vehicle through the rain, noticing the shattered glass near the driver's side, the faint hint of gunpowder residue around the frame, the dark streaks consistent with his struggle. He didn't need to reconstruct every detail to know this wasn't a car accident. This was gunfire, violence, intent. Someone had done this deliberately, and they were still out there. A wave of old instinct told him that predators sometimes linger near the aftermath of their violence to verify results or clean up loose ends. His jaw clenched with that realization. He may have been providing medical care, but he was also standing in an active threat zone. He glanced down the empty road, rain cascading in silver sheets, headlights of his truck fading into the darkness behind him. No other cars, no sirens, no backup, no cavalry. Just him, his daughter, and a dying deputy. He knew he had to maintain control of the scene until help arrived, but help wasn't visible anywhere. The world shrank into a single purpose: maintain life. He reassured Claire again, because even if she couldn't understand his words fully, The tone could anchor her to consciousness. You're not alone. You're staying awake. Right here. She blinked again, her chest rising unevenly beneath his improvised seal. His hands never hesitated. He positioned his knee for stability against the slick pavement and adjusted pressure, keeping the compression consistent as the improvised occlusive barrier held. The battlefield had always been unpredictable. Tonight was no different. The only difference was the geography, but the physics of trauma, the fragility of airway, the fragility of pressure loss, all of it remained universal. Rainwater mixed with blood and formed a swirling red arc around his hand, like the past had followed him here, like the world was reminding him that some chapters never fully close. Transition wouldn't come through adrenaline in this moment. It came through memory. When a man has saved lives before, his soul doesn't forget how, even if his mind tries to bury the past. Tonight on a dark farm road, his soul had stepped forward again, and it was fighting for this deputy's life with the same devotion he once gave to fellow soldiers who depended on him overseas. And though he tried to hide it from the world for years, this moment exposed it again. His healing was not accidental, it was who he was. In a storm that drowned everything else, Colton became the stillness, the control, the hand that defied chaos, because that is what real warriors do when fate places life in front of them. They act. They don't hesitate. They don't wait for permission. They save who they can, because silence only matters if the living survive to experience it. On that road, in that rain, in that moment, he refused to let death take another soul if he could stand in the way. The first glimpse of rescue came not as a siren, not as a roar of engines, but as a faint glow, distant headlights emerging through the sheets of rain like two tired stars, breaking through a storm cloud. Colton didn't relax when he saw them. Those lights could have meant anything. Another civilian, another threat, or delayed responders who might be undertrained for what they were about to witness. But as the shapes grew clearer and the faint outline of an ambulance took form beneath the storm, he exhaled slightly, not relief, but acknowledgement that the baton of responsibility might soon shift to new hands. He didn't step away. Not yet. Not until he knew they were close enough to take over correctly. The Emmy's crew rushed out with urgency, boots splashing through water, raincoats flapping violently in the wind. But when they reached Claire's body and saw the improvised battlefield-level seal, the precise angle he had positioned her at for airway protection, the pressure points he had locked in with perfect anatomical placement, they didn't speak right away. Their eyes widened, not with confusion, but with recognition. One paramedic froze for a half-second, staring at the plastic tape patchwork he had crafted, because this wasn't something a normal civilian would have known how to do. This was advanced trauma care, the kind performed by people who knew what bleeding to death really looked like. They asked him how long she'd been like this, and he answered in short, efficient statements, not emotional, not hesitant, but with the clipped tone of someone who reports facts under pressure. They exchanged glances, trying to understand how a farm handyman knew exactly which interventions to apply and in what sequence. Colton didn't elaborate. He didn't explain. He didn't feel the need to defend his competence. The past didn't require narration. The result spoke for itself. Claire was still alive because he never let hesitation take the wheel. The EMTs stepped into place and began formal stabilization, but they didn't try to undo anything he had applied. They simply built off his work. One paramedic muttered to the other, "This is military trauma control. Who the hell is this guy?" The comment wasn't hostile. It was awe mixed with disbelief. Colton didn't respond. He simply nodded once and stepped back into the rain, giving them room to move the gurney into position. The storm continued to pound the pavement as if God himself was trying to wash away evidence before more evil arrived. The ambulance crew continued to work with respect. They knew they were inheriting a life that was only salvageable because someone with remarkable skill had intervened minutes earlier. Sadie watched it all unfold with a mixture of fear and astonishment. She saw her father step backward slowly, his hands trembling slightly now, not from uncertainty, but from the emotional crash that comes when adrenaline exits the body. The stormlight reflected against the wet streaks of blood on his forearms, and for a moment she didn't see him as just Dad. She saw him as someone the world should have known sooner, someone bigger than a quiet farm fixer. She didn't understand the meaning of military medicine or tactical skills, but she understood her father had done something extraordinary, something that changed the course of another person's life. The paramedics gently loaded Claire onto the gurney and secured her oxygen, placing her inside the ambulance. The door closed with a metallic thud, sealing the transition between death's doorstep and the slim hope of survival. Colton stood in the rain, staring at the ambulance through the downpour, his chest tight with conflicting emotions. Relief that she was alive, fear that she might still not make it, concern that whoever inflicted this wound might be nearby. His fists clenched and loosened repeatedly, a soldier's nervous system rebooting after emergency execution mode. The crew turned back toward him once more, asking if he wanted to ride along. He shook his head. His duty, for now, was done. But the EM's staff didn't hide their astonishment. They continued glancing at him as if trying to solve a puzzle, because they knew the kind of man who could do what he just did was not the kind who spends his days casually tightening bolts on tractor engines. They recognized a different kind of past, one forged in environments far more brutal and unforgiving than a Midwest county. When the ambulance pulled away, rainwater splashed against the taillights, creating bright red reflections across the wet asphalt. The storm swallowed the vehicle quickly, and the lights faded into the darkness. Sadie unlocked the truck door and stepped out, rain hitting her hair immediately, but she didn't care. She ran to him and clung to his side, holding onto him like she had never needed him more in her life. He placed his hand on her small back, steadying her, grounding himself in the presence of the only soul that mattered more than all his SEARS. He knew that this night had changed something, not just for the deputy whose life had been pulled back from the brink, but for him as well. The quiet life he had built was now cracked open. He had stepped back into the world he swore to avoid, even if only for minutes. And now that the professionals had seen what he once was capable of, the truth would not stay invisible for long. When men who understand trauma see someone handle death with mastery, they don't forget it. They remember, they talk, and they ask questions. Tonight, the storm had not just exposed a dying deputy, it had exposed him. In the days that followed, small-town deputy chatter reached every corner of the sheriff's department, not through official memos, not through reports, but through quiet, uneasy conversations exchanged in hallways and squad cars about the humbling reality that a dying deputy had survived a wound she never should have survived. Detectives examined Claire's blood-soaked uniform and found evidence of force that did not align with a routine traffic stop. Shell casings recovered from the scene pointed to coordinated intent, not random violence, and the angle of the gunshot indicated someone had fired with practiced precision. This wasn't a panicked rookie pulling a trigger. This was the work of people who knew how to kill without hesitation. The sheriff, Brett Hawkins, was a solid man in his mid-50s, the kind who spent more nights than he wanted sitting at his desk long after the courthouse. Lights had dimmed, sorting through paperwork tied to crimes that never should have reached his rural corner of America. When he read the first report about the trauma interventions, he frowned, not in confusion, but in recognition. He had served in the military years ago, not on the same level as Colton, but enough to know exactly what battlefield-grade wound management looks like. And this wasn't something that came from a YouTube tutorial or a CPR certification class. Someone with high-end trauma experience had stepped into that storm and fought death the way soldiers do in combat zones. Word began circulating that this attack might connect to a trafficking ring using rural counties to move illegal goods without drawing attention, because criminals know small towns don't have the surveillance density of large cities. This was not the first time Hawkins had heard rumors of such activity, but it was the first time he had hard evidence tied directly to violence. He wasn't just dealing with reckless criminals. He was dealing with strategic predation. He knew they didn't target Claire randomly. They likely wanted her dead because she saw something she wasn't supposed to see. And the man who saved her, whoever he really was, had now unknowingly stepped into a larger war. So Hawkins tracked down Colton quietly. He didn't call him into the station through an official channel. He didn't issue a formal summons. Instead, he waited outside the feed store one late afternoon when the sky was clear, as if choosing the opposite emotional setting of the storm to re-enter this man's world. Colton stepped outside carrying chicken feed, Sadie holding his hand, the sun lighting up the dust drifting in the air around them. Hawkins approached with caution, not like a sheriff questioning a suspect, but like a veteran approaching another veteran who might carry history he knows better than to speak openly about. Hawkins introduced himself, and they shook hands slowly, with that old warrior recognition that doesn't require words. He didn't ask Colton how he knew what to do. He asked why he didn't hesitate. Colton paused, not with fear, but with the hesitation of a man deciding whether he should reopen wounds that had scabbed over long ago. Hawkins leaned slightly closer and spoke with a quiet voice. Those were battlefield methods out there. Colton didn't deny it. He didn't brag. He simply said that someone needed help, and he did what was necessary. Hawkins nodded, because that answer confirmed everything. The sheriff then explained what the investigators were piecing together, that this wasn't just a random act of violence. This was part of a larger organized threat hidden in the cracks between rural counties, using isolated roads and late-night traffic to avoid detection. And Hawkins had to admit something he rarely admitted. The department was not equipped for this scale of criminal sophistication. Claire's survival had cracked open a door into a network much darker than anyone initially realized. And now Hawkins needed someone with strategic operational understanding, someone who could think like a specialist, not a beat cop. He told Colton that he didn't want to drag him into anything, but he couldn't ignore what he saw in that storm. He didn't speak about war. He didn't mention foreign deserts or trauma tents. But both men understood what he really meant. Colton's silence was not refusal, it was caution. The pause of a man who had spent years trying to stay out of the world that took so many of his brothers. That pause said everything, that he didn't want this, but he also knew the stakes were bigger than him now. Sadie squeezed his hand, her small fingers grounding him in the life he cherished more than anything. Hawkins looked at her and then back at Colton, understanding that this man had something to lose now. This wasn't a young soldier who could disappear into purpose. This was a father, a protector. And yet, that kind of man also cannot ignore danger when it surfaces in his own backyard. That is the price of being someone capable of extraordinary reaction. When fate knocks, you don't get to pretend you didn't hear it. So Colton did not say yes, but he didn't say no either. He simply asked what Hawkins knew so far. And that was the moment the sheriff realized the quiet handyman was stepping, reluctantly, into the shadows of this investigation. Colton knew he could not stay on the sidelines anymore. Colton didn't show up in uniform. He didn't sit behind desks. He didn't walk into the sheriff's department asking for permission. He met Hawkins and two detectives in the back corner of an old VFW meeting room on a Monday night, when most of the county had already gone home to prepare for another week of early mornings on farms and construction sites. The air smelled like stale coffee and old wood. Maps were spread across the table, not official state prints, but hand-marked county-level layouts with colored pushpins marking highways, gravel roads, and narrow cut-through paths that locals used when they wanted to avoid traffic lights in town. Colton scanned the maps silently, eyes tracing the angled pattern of the rural road system, mentally overlaying tactical logic on top of what appeared to be random geography. He made no dramatic gestures. He didn't pretend to be a detective. He just stood there quietly, analyzing the county like a battlefield, assessing potential entry and exit points, choke zones, blind turns, and natural cover positions. Where a normal man saw roads, he saw channels of movement. Where others saw farmland, he saw terrain. He didn't think of criminals as bad guys. He thought of them as adversaries who had a playbook, and every playbook has patterns. Sadie stayed home that night with a trusted neighbor, And even though she didn't know the specifics, she sensed her dad was carrying a weight no child language could describe. The next morning, she asked him if the deputy would live. He answered softly, "We did everything we could. Children don't always need details, but they know when their parent is balancing hope and fear at the same time." That tension followed him through his day. He fixed a fence, tuned an engine, and tried to pretend the world remained simple. But inside, he was already working the problem. Back at the VFW, Hawkins asked him what he saw. Colton pointed to one narrow road intersection, not with excitement, but with the precision of someone who had tracked patterns in hostile zones. He explained that traffickers traveling through rural America would need routes with limited surveillance, but also consistent escape pathways. He told them about predicted turn-off points criminals choose when they sense a tail, and how certain road curves naturally reduce visibility for oncoming vehicles. His voice was steady, the calm tone of someone who had explained similar strategies before in situations where stakes were higher than anyone wanted to admit. One detective asked him how he knew all this. Colton didn't puff his chest. He didn't give a backstory. He just said, "I've seen people try not to get caught before," and that single sentence carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken memories. Hawkins didn't press him. Veterans understand when silence is not avoidance, but protection of the past. So he outlined likely paths the traffickers might use next, without claiming certainty. He never pretended to be a prophet. He simply described patterns consistent with motivated actors using rural channels as corridors to bypass law enforcement concentration. And in that quiet VFW hall, with the hum of old neon lights flickering above and the deep creaks of worn floorboards beneath their boots, the men listening realized they were hearing strategy no law enforcement training seminar had prepared them for. He didn't want a badge. He didn't want credit. He wanted his daughter to grow up in a county that wasn't being silently preyed upon by evil. And so he offered insights, not partnership, not allegiance, just knowledge. The kind of knowledge he wished he didn't possess. The kind he earned unwillingly in a past he tried to bury. When he left that meeting, he stepped back into the quiet night outside. But he didn't feel peace. He felt the weight of duty returning, not because he sought it, but because fate had dragged it back to his doorstep. And the moonlit gravel road he drove home looked different now, not like a part of his peaceful county, but like a perimeter of a territory threatened by unseen predators. He didn't ask for this, but he could not ignore it. For the first time since the storm, he questioned whether silence was still an option. The plan formed quietly over the next few days, not through grand speeches, not through media announcements, but through late-night strategy sessions and silent decisions made in dim corners of the county where truth could be spoken without everything being overheard. The sheriff and investigators trusted Colton's insights without forcing him into the spotlight, because they knew the moment his involvement became official, the calm he lived in would be shattered forever. He didn't want to be on radios or tactical briefings. He didn't want a vest or a badge. He wanted one thing: to make sure whoever did this didn't get another chance to hurt anyone else in the place he was trying to build peace for his daughter. The night the operation finally moved, there was no thunder to dramatize it, just a tense, cold stillness in the air that felt heavy enough to break. Colton waited off-road behind a row of hay bales on the Hawley family's old south lot, watching headlights crawl in the distance along the exact route he had predicted. The traffickers moved into the trap not because they were careless, but because they assumed that rural America was blind. They assumed no one in these counties had the intelligence, the training, or the experience to read their patterns. They assumed wrong. And sometimes it only takes one man who understands warfare differently to change everything. Hawkins signaled in silence, a raised hand, a barely visible nod, and within seconds, unmarked vehicles shifted into place, boxing in the target car with precise timing. The takedown was swift, not chaotic, not sloppy, but surgically executed, because the plan was built with a mind who understood that when violence is necessary, clarity prevents disaster. The suspects resisted for a moment, but the moment was small, fragile, weak, because once shock hit them, It was obvious they never had the upper hand. They hadn't realized they were being outmaneuvered by a mind that once stabilized bleeding soldiers under fire while coordinating extraction orders between mortar blasts. In the moments following the arrests, Colton didn't feel pride. He felt exhaustion. He had no interest in watching suspects be dragged and cuffed. He had been around enough human evil in his lifetime to know there is rarely satisfaction in seeing wicked men caught, only temporary relief that they can no longer harm innocent people. He stepped away from the sight of flashing lights, lungs heavy with memories he couldn't shake. He focused instead on the quiet fact that somewhere miles away, Claire Morgan was still fighting, still breathing, because he had given her a chance to. Back at home later that night, Sadie was asleep when he returned, curled up under her blanket with one hand tucked beneath her cheek, unaware of the war her father had just helped prevent from expanding. He tucked the blanket around her shoulders gently, studying her small frame and asking himself, for the 100th time, if exposing any piece of his old self back into the world was worth it. His biggest fear was not dying. He had faced death before, but being taken from his daughter, the way his brothers had been taken from their families. He had carried that fear since leaving the service, and tonight brought that ache back into focus. The sheriff called the next morning to confirm that Claire was stable and that her condition had shifted from critical toward guarded improvement. It wasn't victory, but it was hope. And hope in trauma is currency. Colton closed his eyes when he heard the news, because he didn't need the full medical chart to understand what that meant. He had bought time, and the professionals did the rest. He had slipped into the storm to keep a heartbeat alive long enough for doctors to take over, and they had. That was more than enough. He didn't tell Sadie everything. Children don't need the weight of adult war on their hearts. But when she asked if the deputy was going to be okay, he nodded with a soft smile, and she smiled back with the relief only a child can feel when they realize the world didn't break on their watch. He held her close that morning, not to reassure her, but to anchor himself to the one reason he couldn't allow violence to define his existence anymore. Later, while drinking coffee on the porch with the sunrise warming the wheat fields across the road, he accepted something he had long resisted. That purpose doesn't disappear just because a man walks away from uniform. Purpose is like gravity. It remains, even when hidden under farm boots and quiet routines. He didn't want to be anyone's hero, but he couldn't pretend anymore that he was just another quiet dad. Some men are shaped to protect life, even when that calling haunts them. The criminals were off the road. Claire was alive, and the sheriff's department now understood that ordinary-looking men sometimes carry extraordinary history silently inside them. For the first time since the stormy night, Colton felt something release in his chest, not triumph, but relief, that this chapter might end without rewriting his entire identity back into the battlefield. And yet, even relief carries weight when a man knows the world is unpredictable. But for now, peace held. A week later, the VFW hall door creaked open beneath Colton's hand, the old hinges complaining with the same tired groan they'd had since the building was patched together decades earlier by men who'd already survived one war and were preparing to mentor younger men into another. Inside, veterans sat around folding tables with mismatched mugs of coffee, the air thick with unspoken stories, shared pain, and the kind of respectful silence only found in rooms filled with people who carry ghosts they don't name. Colton didn't come here seeking applause. He came only because Hawkins asked him to drop by so a few people could ask a couple minor questions. He didn't expect anything more. He didn't want anything more. The moment he stepped in, several older men looked up, and the room shifted in a way words cannot fully describe. They recognized something in the way he carried himself, the way his shoulders held tension in quiet readiness, the way his eyes scanned a room instinctively before settling, the microsecond of breath control before he spoke. These weren't civilians examining him. These were men who had once worked medical triage under noise that never stops ringing in your skull, even decades later. They didn't need an introduction. They didn't need paperwork. They saw a brother in silence before a single word left his mouth. One of the older vets, Gray beard, marine rings, hands scarred from years of wrench work after retirement, stepped forward with a slow nod. He asked no questions about where Colton served or what missions he'd been part of. Instead, he simply said, "You did field SEAL work in the rain." He didn't say it as praise. He said it as fact, the kind of fact only recognized by someone who has done the same in another corner of the world. Colton's jaw tightened. He didn't confirm or deny. He just nodded, once, because men like him only speak what's necessary. The Marine nodded back, and that was the entire language exchange. No applause followed. No congratulatory speeches. Just quiet, thick with respect. And that silence was more powerful than any medal. In this room, recognition wasn't given, it was understood. Veterans don't celebrate moments like these, because they're reminders that life or death decisions are made in seconds by men no one sees. Colton had been invisible for years, on purpose, and these men instantly knew he hadn't been invisible because he was ordinary. He had been invisible because some of the greatest warriors in this country don't need a spotlight. They need peace. Hawkins eventually entered and shared the official update that Claire was expected to make a full recovery. Several men bowed their heads in gratitude, some whispering short prayers, not in fancy language, but in the quiet conversational tone used when talking to God as an old friend. Colton closed his eyes for a moment too, because faith had always been a thread he clung to when trauma felt unbearable. He didn't pray for praise. He prayed for silence, for rest, for the ability to continue being the father Sadie needed. When he stepped out into the sunlight afterward, he felt the breeze stretch across the fields like a gentle reminder that life still held simple beauty that didn't need to be earned through sacrifice. The VFW door shut behind him, and something heavy remained inside that hall, not a burden, but the truth that he wasn't alone in his history. Other men here knew what it meant to serve, to save, to carry ghosts, and to want anonymity more than credit. That realization held a certain quiet mercy, a mercy only warriors understand. He didn't walk away taller, or prouder, or more validated. He walked away steadier. Because sometimes the greatest validation a man can receive is the silent acknowledgement of others who understand the same pain and the same calling, without exchanging a single detailed story. Colton didn't need a medal pinned to his chest. The men inside that hall saw the invisible ones already etched into his soul. When he returned home, Sadie ran out onto the porch to greet him, barefoot and smiling, carrying a crayon drawing of him holding her hand. She said she made it because she liked when he kept her safe. He knelt to her level, hugged her tight, and felt something warm settle inside him, not the old adrenaline, not the soldier instinct, but the affirmation that being a father was his greatest assignment, bigger than war, bigger than any skill he ever learned overseas. And as the sun dipped behind the wheat fields, he took her hand and walked inside, not to celebrate, but to live quietly again with the knowledge that some heroes don't brag, don't boast, and don't need the world to know their name. They simply stand up when life demands it, and then they return to the life they love in silence, because honor doesn't shout, it whispers.